So what about response then? I've got one little definition here. Again, coming from that Handbook 9 for you. Emergency response involves actions taken in anticipation of, during, and immediately after an emergency to ensure that its impacts are minimised and that people affected are given immediate relief and support. Again, this is a pretty huge thing, and there's a lot of different people involved, but certain people are involved in particular stages of response, I would argue, more so than in other phases. So whereas everyone needs to be involved in preparedness and even in prevention and mitigation, in terms of response, there's very specific people that are involved, and of course, if we've done preparedness appropriately, all of those people that are involved in those processes will be involved in response to a certain extent. But the first line first responders are the ones that are probably the core involved in response activities. Having said that, if we look at this particular image that I took from, I think it's the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, it may not be, it may be Emergency Management Victoria, no, I'm pretty sure it's the AIDR. We can see a whole bunch of different types of places, people, etc. that are involved in response activities. The government is right here at the core of it. Then we've got the SES, Emergency Management Council, Emergency Management Australia and other organisations. We can also see on the outer, sort of clouds of this diagram, we've got the Citizen Corps, we've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, churches, neighbourhoods, port authorities, private sectors, business associations, media, schools, national consortiums, medical associations. All of these organisations are involved in response in some way, depending on what the circumstances of the emergency are. So it's pretty complex. As with every other phase of emergency management, response involves specific people and implies specific activities. It often involves local individuals and agencies. We can see the local emergency services personnel, assessing the incident, securing the scene and maintaining order, rescuing and treating the injured, containing and suppressing fires or other hazardous conditions, retrieving dead individuals, and stabilising the situation. So that's a very localised response that we're seeing there. Not necessarily just first responders though. We can see the Red Cross involved in this a lot, for instance, as a non-government organisation too. We can see state and national government actors. They initiate higher level of response if it's needed. Non-government organisations and volunteer actors involved as well. They address the immediate needs of disaster victims. Then we've got private business actors who are involved in providing other forms of support depending on what the circumstances are. So it might be as little as a local butcher who is obviously not going to be able to sell any of their sausages if there's some sort of emergency management situation happening. They decide to take all of their sausages and cook them up for all of the people who need food, rather than seeing it all go to waste. So just simple things like that involving private businesses. But of course, it's a lot more complex than that. That's just a very sort of simplistic example. Then we have local emergency management actors, which are very much around, they work around developing and maintaining the community's suite of emergency plans, including those for emergency operations or response. They also may serve another role in local government. So often you'll find a whole range of different people who are doing an emergency management role, but they're doing it off the side of their desk. So they might be a police officer and the emergency management is 10% or 20% of their role. They might be working in Department of Health and Human Services, and again, emergency management is sort of 20% of their role. So that's a very common circumstance where they're just doing it off the side of their desk, so to speak. To give you some sense of the broad scope of response, these are just some of the plans that are involved at the federal level in relation to different types of emergency and disaster planning in Australia. We've got the COMDIS plan. I'm not going to talk through what each of these do. You can definitely get online and Google and have a read of them. I'm pretty sure all of them are available online for you. We've got the Oz Assist plan, explains coordination, physical assistance processes. We've got the Oz Reset plan, which is looking at how the Australian government evacuates Australian citizens and approved foreign nationals in other overseas emergency management processes. We've got the Oz AV plan, which is a plan that explains how the Oz government works with state and territory governments and industry stakeholders in an aviation disaster. We've got the Oz Pred plan, which of course talks about how the Australian government manages risk posed by re-entering space debris. Who would have thought? But yes, that is a thing, which may impact Australia. As well as the NatCat-DIS plan. I'm not going to even try and say this one. Natural Catastrophic Natural Disaster Plan, that explains the national coordination arrangements for supporting states, territories and Australian government in responding and recovering from catastrophic national disasters in Australia, natural disasters. And of course, a good example of this would be something like Hurricane Katrina happening in Australia. So all of these plans have a different role. They're all equally as complex and interesting to have a read of if you're interested in going down that path. But that gives you a sense that's just the national level plans. It's not the local level plans, it's not the state level plans, it's not even the plans involving different non-government organisations. It's just the federal ones. So what activities are involved in response? This is pretty straightforward stuff, really. The stuff that we've capped off on a little bit already. Providing warning messages to the public, as well as different forms of public information using Facebook and Twitter and so forth, as well as radio broadcasts. Television broadcasts probably not so much. They'll assume that everyone has access to TV and put stuff out over the TV, but often they will focus the most updated information, in particular radio channels and so forth, for those communities who are directly impacted and they know they don't have electricity. Evacuation is a big one, obviously. Firefighting, if it's a bushfire, for instance, is a huge one. Making sure they neutralise hazardous materials and contain those hazards, depending on what the circumstances are around a chemical emergency or a technological emergency, such as a nuclear meltdown, for instance. Providing medical support to people who need it. Providing food, water and shelter for people who need it. Searching and rescuing for people who are in need of rescue, or searching for those who are missing. Establishing coordination and evacuation centres. Looking at animal and stock welfare, looking at fodder drops and so forth, for instance. It is pretty important for cows that are stranded in certain flood-affected regions, for example. And overall, going through the process of assessing damage to make sure they understand exactly where and how the recovery efforts need to then start off. So what are the key challenges with response? These are some of the things that we're going to be talking about a little bit more in relation to Hurricane Katrina and in relation to the Victorian bushfires. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this. But these are just some of the core things that can be really challenging around response. Number one is most certainly loss of life of first responders. So the September 11 terrorist attacks was a really good example of this, where when the first plane hit the building, a lot of emergency first responders went straight in there and responded to that circumstance, but they did so without knowing that there was going to be a second plane, and of course not knowing at that particular point that the buildings were not safe and they were going to collapse. So thousands of first responders were, perhaps not thousands, but I would imagine at least 1,000, if at the very least hundreds. In fact, I haven't looked up the statistics around those types of things, but they were very much the first people on scene, and they were a good deal of the casualties involved in the September 11 terrorist attacks. What do we do then in the event that the first responders are actually being killed en masse in the circumstance where something like this happens? The people on the ground are not prepared. It's quite a common issue, and the extent to which they're not prepared really depends on the circumstance. But for instance, one could argue that the Victorian bushfires were a good example of this, because a lot of the people on the ground were not prepared for the ferocity of the fires that were coming through, just as people were not prepared for the 1965 Tasmanian bushfires, 67 Tasmanian bushfires. Long-term warnings are often ignored. We can see this as a key issue in relation to Hurricane Katrina. There was at least a few days before Katrina hit landfall that they were given warnings about them, telling people to get out and so forth. And the long term, even though they seem like fairly short term, they're very much long term in the grand scheme of things, where those warnings have been completely ignored by certainly government officials and so forth. Government officials make poor decisions, and they take no action to get people out, or alternatively, those warnings that the government officials do put out are completely ignored by the individuals. And we can see this in the little sort of cartoon thing I've put up here of Jersey Shore, where there's a hurricane coming across and people are still sort of partying and celebrating whatever Jersey Shore is. I haven't even Googled it. And completely ignoring it, and they're in the midst of a very, very significant hurricane. And of course, then we have things like failure of response systems, and this is a common situation depending on what the circumstances are and how much preparation a local government has done. So they may not have tested tsunami warning systems, for instance, for 5 years, and then all of a sudden a tsunami is coming and the warning system doesn't work, and they don't have the capacity to tell the community to get out, basically. So there are some very common challenges with response processes.